Harden, hope you enjoyed your Romans study this week. I want to land in Romans 8:28 through 30. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Now, what a rich statement in Romans 8:28, that God is working all things for our good when we love God. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, it doesn't mean that everything in your life is going to be good. It doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer. In fact, you live in a fallen world, so you're going to have people die around you. You're going to get sick. You might actually get cancer. You might lose a job. So some bad things might actually happen in your life. But here's the wonderful truth that God gives us, that even in the midst of a fallen world, when you suffer and you go through things, God is working all those things out for your good. Now, what is your good? Well, he goes on and he tells us that the good is that we're conformed to the image of his son, Jesus Christ. He says this in verse 29, for those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. Now, sometimes we're afraid of that language, foreknew and predestined, but notice what the text says. He predestined you. He predetermined that there would be an outcome of your life, and that is that you would be conformed to the image of his son, Jesus Christ. So all those things in your life, whether you're suffering or you're on the high of a mountain, all those things God is working for your good. And what is that good? He's got a predetermined plan, and that is for you to be just like his son, to bear the image of Jesus Christ. That is the good that God is working out in your life if you love God. And then he gives us a little bit of background, a little bit of the foundation for why that is true. And he goes on and he says this, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So the goal is for Jesus to be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. That's the goal of our salvation. But then he says this in verse 30, and those he predestined, he also called. And those who he called, he also justified. And those who he justified, he also glorified. Here we see this unbreakable chain to God's glorious salvation. He goes back and he says, look, those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. So those who he knew before the beginning of time, he had a relationship with those people in a real sense. Those whom he foreknew, he predestined. So we predestined, right, to make us in the image of his son. So what did he do with those whom he foreknew and those who he predestined? It says he also called. So he called those people, and that happens through the gospel, that when those who've been foreknown and those who have been predestined, when they hear the gospel, it's the very calling of God. They respond. They're the sheep who hear the shepherd's voice in John 10. They're the ones who come to Jesus Christ and put their faith in him. Those whom he called, he also justified. That means he's made those people whom he's foreknew, predestined, and called. He justifies them. He makes them right with himself. He forgives their sin and gives them a relationship with himself. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. That's in the future sense. He glorifies us. We're going to have a new body and we're going to live with Jesus forever in the new kingdom. So this is what's sometimes called the unbreakable chain. So if you go backwards, think about those who are glorified, those who get the kingdom, those who are in heaven, those with new bodies, glorification. Who are those people? It's those who are justified, those who are made right with God. Well, who are the ones who are justified? It's those who were called, those who were called out by God. Well, who are called out by God? It's those whom he predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. Well, who did he predestine? Those whom he foreknew, those whom he set his covenant love upon before the creation of the world. Now just think about that. If you're a believer in Christ, here's what that means. If you've responded to the gospel that before you were born, God foreknew you, he predestined you, and in real time he called you, and upon your response, he justified you, and he's promising to glorify you. That's how Paul can go on and say, what can separate us from the love of God? Nothing, no angels, no death, nor life, nothing in this present age can separate us from the love of God. Why? Because God who's going to glorify you is God who also foreknew you. So God's salvation rests in his grace alone in your life and not in your goodness or your righteousness or you trying to keep this thing going. No, it's based in the eternal plan of God. Here's how you know all things are going to work together for your good. Because God who started something before you were born in foreknowing and predestining you, God's not going to let that fall apart. He is going to glorify you. All those things in your life are going to work out for your good. Why? Because he's made a promise that those who he's called and justified, he's glorified as well. So you're going to be with God forever. No matter what happens, he's going to use it all to make you more like Jesus, and you're going to spend forever with Jesus. That is the good news of the gospel. So that was week 4. Hopefully you enjoyed your reading, and I look forward to seeing you next week.